Hello, this is Tom Turner. I edit the gardenvisit.com website and the landscapearchitecture.org.uk website, and I've written books on both subjects. In launching a set of podcasts, my plan is to take an overview of urban design, garden design and landscape design, their history, theory, position and prospects. The subject of this podcast is a fascinating but somewhat abstruse topic: design theory and methods. Just as cooking methods like boiling, frying and roasting have an enormous influence on the result, so do design methods. If you doubt this, consider the potato. It can be mashed, deep fried, boiled or turned into crisps. Alternative design methods are even more influential, and really, it's time for the whole profession to move on from the old 20th century survey analysis design methodology. It dates back to the modernist period in landscape design, and that's where it belongs. One of the many things I learned from reading Ian McHarg's Design with Nature was that landscape architecture can and should draw on many other disciplines. But how? It's not easy. The proposal in this podcast, which comes from a third chapter of my book on city as landscape, is that patterns can serve as an exchange format. If they combine words and images, they can bring together information and ideas from many disciplines. GIS, which I plan to discuss in a future podcast, has the capability to analyse patterns. The discussion in this podcast was inspired by great design theorist Christopher Alexander. He wrote an essay in 1966 with the title "A City is Not a Tree," and is a significant influence on McHarg. The title of the 1996 chapter from which this podcast comes was "A City is Not a Tree, It is a Landscape." So let's get started. Complexity is one of the great problems in environmental design, because adequate information about the existing environment and about the types of place that it is desirable to make cannot be kept inside one brain. The invention of design by drawing made a significant contribution to this problem. Drawings help people to work out intricate relationships between parts. Mathematical calculations are facilitated. Many designers can cooperate on one project, each working on a part of the whole. This requires one person to produce a key plan or master plan which coordinates the phasing, the drawings and the construction. The people who produced these drawings became known as master planners. And in environmental design, the art of producing overall layout drawings came to be known as master planning. If one is attracted to being a master or to having a master, this prospect may be alluring. The caption I used for figure 1 was "Plans can master sites, unfortunately." Christopher Alexander is an Austro-English-American mathematician and architect who has been described as the world's leading design theorist. He proposed two radically different ways of dealing with the complexity in design. Let's begin with a caricature. After leaving England to study architecture at Harvard, Alexander became a classical East Coast highbrow, applying cold reason and higher mathematics to design. His 1964 Notes on the Synthesis of Form envisaged a modernist, computerized and wholly rational design method, which didn't work. After moving to the West Coast, Alexander grew his hair and applied group creativity and folk wisdom to design. The pattern language was the result of this work. It was conceived as the archetypal core of all possible pattern languages, which can make people feel alive and human. So, let's consider the East and West phases of Alexander's thinking on design theory. First, the East Coast solution. Alexander's East Coast solution to the problem of complexity in design dates from the 1960s, when electronic computers first became generally available in institutions. It seemed that well-programmed impersonal machines could take the place of fallible masters with a zest for tyranny. Maybe the computers could even become superior masters. Alexander's notes suggested that large-scale forms could be synthesized after analyzing large problems into small problems, so that they could be picked off one at a time. Appropriately, the first example was a vacuum cleaner. The design problem was divided into a series of binary relationships, for example, between jointing and simplicity or performance and economy, so that each could be dealt with. The largest example was the determinants of form in an Indian village. They were broken down into 141 components and classified as religion, social forces, agriculture, water, etc. Here are 7 of the 141 components. 1. Harijans regarded as ritually impure. 6. Wish for temples. 16. Women gossip extensively while bathing and fetching water. 18. Need to divide land among sons of successive generations. 79. Provision of cool breeze. 107. Soil conservation. 141. Prevent migration of young people and Harijans to cities. Before anyone takes offence at women gossip as a design problem, it should be noted that the list contained both design objectives and design problems. The full sequence was described as a tree of diagrams, as shown in Figure 2. 2 years later, Alexander had a change of heart, and in 1966 published his seminal essay, A City is Not a Tree. By a tree, he meant a hierarchy. Alexander emphasized that cities are not hierarchies, and that when planners believe they are, they produce the horrors of planned towns with road hierarchies, business areas, and useless open space. The example of a bus stop was used in A City is Not a Tree to show that a bus stop is not merely a stage on a bus route. It also figures in patterns of shopping, walking, waiting, talking, etc. And these considerations led Alexander to argue against artificial cities and in favour of organic cities. He stated that cities are semi-lattice structures, not tree structures. As shown in Figure 3, the argument can be taken further. A city is not a tree. It is not even an object. It is a set of landscapes. Every characteristic overlaps a host of other characteristics. Thinking about city structure led Alexander to recommend a second approach to the problem of complexity in design. In Figure 3, the top 4 diagrams are based on Christopher Alexander. The lower 2 diagrams, which I drew, show that the semi-lattice of urban structure needs to be related to the lattice of the existing landscape, which is shown in green. So then, second, the West Coast solution. Alexander launched his California answer to the problem of design complexity in 1977. The theory was explained in 3 books: The Timeless Way of Building in 1979, A Pattern Language, Towns, Buildings, Construction, 1977, and The Oregon Experiment, 1975. Although colloquially described as Alexander's pattern language, the book had 6 authors and numerous collaborators. It was a result of 8 years' work at the Centre for Environmental Structure. If one came across this title in a telephone directory, one might take it for a geological research centre. And since geologists also look for structures, one could learn from one's mistake. The central argument of the pattern language is that in the face of complexity, humans have evolved archetypal patterns, which can help solve recurrent problems. And these solutions are called patterns. In primitive societies, birds and humans had ways of using mud and grass to make dwellings. They remained constant from generation to generation. In modern societies, a greater range of patterns is available. Yet, the pattern language argues, there are still ways of doing things that, over an endless period of time, have satisfied complex human requirements. An ancient example is finding a choice location for an outdoor seat. Neglect of this pattern has led to a modern tragedy. Most outdoor seats in most towns in most countries are woefully sited. Their locations are unprotected, isolated, noisy, and windy too. Claustrophobic, too hot or too cold. The ancient pattern was to place a seat near a tree, with its back to a wall, in a sunny position, with a good view, as shown in Figure 4. The archetype for this solution balances prospect with refuge. J. Appleton, in The Experience of Landscape, a book published in 1975, sees this balance as a fundamental human need. It satisfies our desire for safety, comfort, and a good vantage point. To avoid blunders, planners and designers must have this information. Using the ancient patterns will, Alexander asserts, produce the quality without a name. He explains, "The first place I think of when I try to tell someone about this quality is a corner of an English country garden, where a peach tree grows against a wall. The wall runs from east to west. The sun shines on the tree as it warms the bricks behind the tree, and the warm bricks themselves warm the peaches in the tree. It has a slightly dozy quality." In seeking to further describe this quality, Alexander considers the following adjectives: alive, whole, comfortable, free, exact, egoless, and eternal. But he rejects each of them, and the pattern language is described as timeless. Most of the book is devoted to accounts of the 253 individual patterns. As archetypes for good places, they have great theoretical importance for planners, architects, and landscape designers. Tony Ward is quoted on the dust jacket of the pattern language as saying, "I believe this to be perhaps the most important book on architectural design published this century. Every library, every school, and every first-year student should have a copy. With regard to the social aspect of design, I wholeheartedly agree. But let's review some enemies of the pattern language. Kimberly Davey, in a 1990 article on the pattern language and its enemies, praises the language as a very powerful ideology indeed, perhaps the most rigorous single knowledge base in current environmental design theory. But he then reviews a savage host of 13 isms, charging downhill upon the language. The line of battle stands as follows: dualism, positivism, empiricism, capitalism, consumerism, individualism, postmodernism, formalism, relativism, gigantism, puritanism, totalitarianism, and pessimism. Like a good general, Davey places the foes in groups, shown in Figure 6. Let's go through them. First, the epistemological enemies. Alexander's Taoist assertion that the aim of environmental design is to produce the quality without a name attracts opposition from Western dualism, positivism, and empiricism. None of these philosophical movements has room for a quality that cannot be put into words, but which is supposed to be objectively verifiable. Second, the political enemies. Some of the patterns are in opposition to capitalism, consumerism, and individualism. They imply a reorganization of society along socialist lines, with controls on the property market and compulsory acquisition of private land. Third, the ideological enemies. Alexander's piecemeal approach to development is opposed to the gigantism, the totalitarianism, and the puritanical desire for order that characterizes large corporations and government departments. Fourth, the aesthetic enemies. In emphasizing the human context of environmental design, Alexander goes against the postmodernism, formalism, and relativism of current architectural theory. These tendencies emphasize style as a central objective in building design. In this foul horde, some enemies oppose Alexander, some oppose individual patterns, and some oppose the interconnecting language. This makes them easier to deal with. In a short essay, one can only propose strategies for deflecting the force of the charge. The epistemological enemies can be defused by letting go of the claim that patterns have objective certainty. For example, I disagree with pattern 144's instruction to concentrate the bathing room, toilets, showers and basins of the house in a single tiled area, but I can see that others may give this pattern their support. The political enemies can be thrown off the scent by removing a few of the patterns from the list. For example, pattern 79, which would make life difficult for students, could go. It tells us to do everything possible to make the traditional forms of rental impossible, indeed illegal. The aesthetic enemies can be accommodated by accepting, as Alexander has done, that there is an aesthetic dimension to environmental design. Pattern 134, for example, states that if the there is a beautiful view, don't spoil it by building huge windows that gape incessantly at it. The ideological enemies can be dealt with by accepting that there are roles for both piecemeal and comprehensive approaches to planning. Some patterns, number 68 for example, actually incite us to comprehensive planning. Alexander advises us to break the urban area down into local transport areas, each one between 1 and 2 miles across, surrounded by a ring road. Instead of dealing with the pattern language at the level of high theory, I recommend scrutiny of the individual patterns. Each is set out according to an 8-part rule. First, a number and a name. Second, a photograph, which shows an archetypal example of the pattern. Third, a paragraph on upward links, explaining how the pattern in question can help to complete larger patterns. Fourth, a statement of the problem, giving its essence. Fifth, a discussion of the empirical background to the pattern, the evidence for it being correct. Sixth, a statement of the solution, giving its essence. Seventh, a diagram to show the main components of the solution. And eighth, a paragraph on downward links, explaining how the pattern can provide a context for smaller patterns. Let's take 2 examples, both of which I've abbreviated. Name: Pattern 92, bus stop, upward links. Pattern 20, minibuses. Problem: bus stops must be easy to recognise and pleasant, with enough activity around them to make people comfortable and safe. Empirical background: bus stops are often dreary, shabby places where no thought has been given to the experience of waiting there. They could be comfortable and delightful places, forming part of a web of relationships. Solution: build bus stops so that they form tiny centres of public life. Build them as part of the gateways into neighbourhoods, work communities and parts of town. Locate them so that they work together with several other activities, at least a newsstand, maps, outdoor shelter, seats, and in various combinations, corner groceries, smoke shops, coffee bar, tree places, special road crossings, public bathrooms, and squares. Diagram, see figure 7. Downward links: pattern 53, main gateway. Pattern 69, public outdoor room. Pattern 121, path shape. Pattern 150, a place to wait. Pattern 93, food stand. Pattern 241, seat spots. This pattern for a bus stop, number 92, is delightful. And multiple use is a necessity if bus stops are to provide personal security. If they were all well planned, cities would be much nicer places. Now let's turn to the second example. Name: pattern 105, south-facing outdoors. Upward links: 104, site repair. Problem: people use open space if it is sunny and do not use it if it isn't, in all but desert climates. Empirical background: if a building is placed right, the building and its gardens will be happy places, full of activity and laughter. If it's done wrong, then all the attention in the world and the most beautiful details will not prevent it from being a silent and gloomy place. Although the idea of south-facing open space is simple, it has great consequences, and there will have to be major changes in land use to make it come right. For example, residential neighbourhoods would have to be organised quite differently from the way they are laid out today. Solution: always place buildings to the north of the open outdoor space that go with them, and keep the outdoor spaces to the south. Never leave a deep band of shade between the building and the sunny part of the outdoors. Diagram. See figure 8. Downward links. Pattern 111, half-hidden garden. Pattern 106, positive outdoor space. 107, wings of light. 128, indoor sunlight. 162, north face. And pattern 161, sunny place. A moment's reflection on the above patterns will reveal that the 13 isms are paper tigers. Though a Taoist, a Christian, a capitalist, a communist, a positivist, and a great dictator may disagree about many things, they will surely agree that sitting in the sun is pleasant, while sitting in the cold or queuing for a bus in an exposed street corner is unpleasant. As though to prove the point, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill are shown in the famous Yalta photograph, figure 9, looking wrapped up but miserable. It's heartening to see 3 old men with the fate of the world in their hands, lamenting a lack of the simplest of human pleasures. In a sunny place, they might have taken better decisions. If the Alexander patterns can attract broad support from diverse political and philosophical standpoints, they have sufficient truth to justify their use by environmental designers, without worrying too much about their epistemological and political status. The Yalta photograph also illustrates that in one critical respect, the patterns are relative truths, not absolute. They depend upon characteristics of the natural environment. Buildings should face north in the southern hemisphere. Sitting out of doors is not always pleasant. Sunny places are loved in cool conditions. Shady places are necessary in hot, arid conditions. Breezy places are desired in hot, humid conditions. And in the Arctic, shelter is essential and outweighs the need for sun. These climatic points can be broadened into the general proposition that the Alexander patterns must be integrated with characteristics of the natural environment if they are to succeed. However well pattern 52, network of paths and cars, may be implemented, it will not succeed if it ignores the patterns of wind, rain, snow, floods, and geological hazards. This consideration argues against the streak of absolutism that, it cannot be denied, exists in the pattern language. Many of the patterns seem to say, do this, it is right, no other way exists. Another point arising from the individual patterns is that they cannot be divorced from aesthetics. Alexander writes that if an outdoor space is badly oriented then the most beautiful details will not prevent it from being a silent and gloomy place. Nor will beauty sell many cars if they are unsafe, uncomfortable, and unreliable. Yet, who can doubt the importance of looks in marketing cars, houses, clothes, holidays, and most consumer products, and environmental designs? If the patterns in the pattern language are to reach their full potential, they must be integrated with aesthetic judgments. And the high artistic standard of the photographs in the pattern language demonstrates the author's deep awareness of this point. And Alexander's 1993 book on the colour and geometry of Turkish carpets provides further evidence. The pattern language can gain strength by linking arms with other types of pattern. Next is a review of structural friends of the pattern language. The pattern language has abundant structural friends, which also happen to be its relatives. See Figure 10. They are found in psychology, ecology, geomorphology, art, design, geometry, planning, and other subjects too. Each of these disciplines identifies structures of a particular kind. The Oxford English Dictionary gives the following definition of structuralism, which isn't a very easy concept. It defines it as any theory or method in which a discipline or field of study is envisaged as combining elements interrelated in systems and structures at various levels. The structures and the interrelationships of their elements being regarded as more significant than the elements considered in isolation. Also, more recently, theories concerned with analysing the surface structures of a system in terms of its underlying structure. The OED goes on to give three uses of structuralism, which overlap. General structuralism, as in Piaget, linguistic structuralism, as in Saussure, and anthropological structuralism, as in Levi-Strauss. Christopher Alexander's theory of environmental structure, which led to his developing the pattern language, is close to being within the category of general structuralism. His use of the term language signifies that the patterns can discover friends in disciplines which have looked for patterns in surface structures, deep structures, and superstructures. Knowledge of structural patterns, of their grammars and their vocabularies, helps one to deal with the complexity of environmental design and planning. So next, I'm going to review 7 sets of friends of the pattern language, starting with psychological patterns. Psychology is the study of the psyche. Aiming to find out about the workings of the mind, modern psychology divides into a number of topics: perception, motivation, emotion, learning, thinking, intelligence, personality, and innate patterns. It's a large subject, which has often been dominated by individuals, and I'll mention a few of them. Carl Jung is one of the most important psychologists for landscape theory. He saw the psyche as an operational whole with 3 important levels: the conscious, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. Consciousness is the only part of the mind that we know. The personal unconscious, which was of great interest to Sigmund Freud, comprises all those experiences that are not recognized by the conscious part of the mind. Discovery of the collective unconscious was Jung's most important contribution to psychology and a significant influence on Geoffrey Jellicoe. It can be thought of as a reservoir of primordial images inherited from man's evolutionary past. As innate patterns, they form predispositions towards responding to the world in ways that were developed by our remote ancestors. Fear of the dark, of isolation, of separation from a refuge, come from countless generations of human experience. Jung believed that the collective unconscious could be thought of as a series of archetypes, which he painted. Among those he described, some related to living things, some to natural objects, and some to man-made objects. They included birth, death, power, magic, the hero, the wise old man, the earth mother, trees, the sun, wind, rivers, fire, animals, rings, tools, and weapons. These archetypes are not images. They are patterns which became focused through experience. For example, every infant is born with a mother archetype, and it becomes a definite image after experience of the individual mother's appearance and behaviour. Jung believed that symbols are the outward manifestation of collective archetypes, and he therefore spent the latter part of his life analysing symbols, dreams, myths and art as a way of finding out about the collective unconscious. See Figure 11. It's useful for creative artists and designers to understand symbols and their relationship to the unconscious mind. When Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe addressed the Architectural Association on his 90th birthday, he remarked that, "You may wonder what I've been doing since I resigned as principal of this school 50 years ago. I would like to tell you, I have been exploring the unconscious." 50 years earlier, the AA school had been engulfed by abstract modernism. Jellicoe realised that if designers were to see their work as symbol-free, compositions of abstract lines, colours and patterns, they would be making a major departure from everything that their predecessors had done. So in turning back from vacantly abstract art, Jellicoe was one of the first postmodernists in landscape design. Gestalt Psychology is also concerned with relationships. In German, the word Gestalt is used to describe the way a thing has been shaped, formed, configured, or put together. In psychology, Gestalt is often translated as pattern. Gestalt psychology began in Austria and South Germany towards the end of the 19th century as a counter-movement to the practice of analysing experience into ever smaller elements. Typical phrases to summarise Gestalt psychology are "the whole is greater than the sum of the parts" and "understanding the parts cannot provide an understanding of the whole." If 100 light spots are projected onto a wall at 1 second intervals, they'll be meaningless. Projected at 0.003 second intervals, they can form a recognisable pattern. Similarly, a melody is more than a series of notes. Designers are often engaged in creating forms that can be read as static patterns or as serial patterns, as Bernard Twomy argued. Piaget developed a theory of learning that relates to Gestalt psychology. He believed that thinking arises in situations where reflex actions and learned routines are insufficient. Piaget therefore identified separate stages in the development of a person's thinking. As children become adults, they learn to classify objects and to think in logical and experimental ways. By trial, error and experience, they formulate mental structures to deal with new situations. Piaget identified the psychological properties as wholeness, relationships between parts, and homeostatic adjustment in the light of new experiences. Structural thinking of this type was applied to other fields. Noam Chomsky identified deep structures in language. And Christopher Alexander, who knew him at Harvard, applied Gestalt ideas to design theory. In his 1977 introduction to the pattern language, Alexander writes, "Each pattern can exist in the world only to the extent that is supported by other patterns. The larger patterns in which it is embedded, the patterns of the same size that surround it, and the smaller patterns that are embedded in it. This is a fundamental view of the world. It says that when you build a thing, you cannot merely build that thing in isolation, but must repair the world around it and within it, so that the larger world at that one place becomes more coherent and more whole. And the thing which you make takes its place in the web of nature as you make it." This is a Gestalt approach to environmental design. Now let's consider landscape ecological patterns. Ecologists study relationships between living things and their environment. As a discipline, ecology was a reaction to the concentration of biologists and botanists on individual species, just as Gestalt psychology was a reaction to the focus on individual perceptual elements. Both disciplines emerged in late 19th century Germany. Landscape ecology is a further development of ecology. Instead of examining individual habitats, the discipline looks at landscape structures and patterns. See Figure 12. Foreman and Gaudron introduced the concept of landscape ecology by comparing the patterns in 4 agricultural landscapes. One in Wisconsin, one in a coniferous forest in Canada, one in a tropical rainforest in Colombia, and one in the Mediterranean landscape in southern France. Despite their differences, each is found to share a fundamental structure composed of patches, corridors, and a background matrix. Here's a quotation from Foreman and Gaudron's 1986 book on landscape ecology. The agricultural and coniferous landscapes had small, distinct patches. The rainforest landscape in distinct patches, and the Mediterranean landscape contained a mixture of large, small, distinct and indistinct patches. Geomorphic controls predominate in the rainforest. Natural disturbances and geomorphology in the coniferous forest. Human influence in the agricultural landscape, and all three in the Mediterranean case. Corridors and linearity are most pronounced in the agricultural landscape and least evident in the rainforest and the coniferous forest. The background matrix is field in the agricultural landscape, forest in the next two, and hard to determine in the Mediterranean case. Landscape structures can be used to inform landscape planning and management decisions. If, for example, an ecological corridor is to contain a housing area, it is necessary to assess the interactions between the proposed new patch and its surroundings. We need to ask, is the corridor a route for wildlife movement? Does it contain floodwater and protect downstream areas? Will the new patch cause a discharge of pollutants into adjoining patches? Landscape ecological patterns help in answering these questions and this type of question. Next is behaviour patterns. The study of animal behaviour developed in the first half of the 20th century, with Konrad Lorenz as the pioneer. He applied the systematic methods of comparative anatomy to the study of animal and human behaviour. This subject became known as ethology. Lorenz's early work was on the process of imprinting, by which young geese learn to follow their parents. Later, he argued that animals are genetically constructed to learn other behaviour patterns that are important for their reproduction and survival. Much can be learned about human nature from the study of observable behaviour patterns, as William H. White later did. In a 1963 book on aggression in animals and humans, Lorenz speculates as to what conclusions might be drawn by a Martian who could observe human behaviour only through a telescope. Detailed behaviour studies, which are a way of studying the mind from the outside, have since had an impact on design and planning. It has been, for example, discovered that burglars are more likely to force entry to a house that has access to the rear windows. Other things being equal, vehicles and pedestrians will always take the shortest route between 2 points. The line they take is known to landscape theory as a desire line. In choosing a place for a picnic, people prefer to lay out their rug near the edge of a space. Pedestrian spaces are most likely to attract people when they are at the focal points of circulation networks. Access to water is the chief goal of recreational trips. Despite the existence of pets and supermarkets, people yearn for contact with wild animals and to collect wild food. Such behaviour patterns, which can be verified either by personal observation or by systematic data collection, are essential knowledge for those who plan outdoor space. So much for psychological patterns. Let's move on to story patterns. In the days when stories were passed on by word of mouth from generation to generation, details became blurred and structural patterns were laid bare. Vladimir Propp initiated the structural analysis of wonder tales, also known as fairy tales, which others have taken up. An amazing worldwide uniformity has been found in such tales, indicating archetypes. Their themes are hope and tragedy. Paradise is lost and paradise is found again. The Cinderella story is a classic example. She lived in paradise until her mother died. Then came trials, tribulations, and mysterious happenings. And, eventually, a happy ending. In other wonder tales, a young man sets off from home, encounters evil, remains steadfast, is helped by magic powers, passes tests, marries the king's daughter, and lives happily ever after. Various elements in these stories have symbolic content. Wood depicts the wholeness of the primordial state. Birds change into women. Dark forests symbolize terror. Animals represent the instinctive forces. Water may lead to a magic kingdom. Spiritual adventure is the subject of wonder tales. People identify comparable patterns in their own lives and discover more about their inner natures. Elements of wonder tales can also appear in the physical environment. Scandinavian cities, for example, are filled with statuary, but only one of them is world famous. The Little Mermaid in Copenhagen, shown in figure 13, was inspired by Hans Christian Andersen's tale of that name. She is beautiful in herself, but it is her position on the water's edge, consequential upon the story, and exposing her to sea, sun, wind, tides, and frost, that so greatly enhances her appeal. She is the pitiful creature who rescued a prince, fell in love with him, died when he married a mortal, and turned into foam. She is part of an exceedingly powerful pattern system. She is not, in the crude phrase that critics apply to misplaced public sculptures, a turd in a plaza. Next is geomorphological patterns. It is now accepted by almost everyone that the world evolved by slow degrees over an immense period of time. Geomorphological patterns result from the natural processes that made the world: heating, cooling, erosion, deposition, wave action, water flow, airflow, and others. Some of these patterns can be seen with the human eye at ground level. We love to gaze at the sand patterns on a beach, or the patterns formed by rocks. Figure 14. Seabirds, though all have the optical capacity to detect such patterns, will only see patterns if they're important to their feeding or breeding habits. Sylvia Crow wrote about visible landscape patterns as seen by humans in The Pattern of Landscape, a 1988 book. Other natural patterns can be detected with special equipment, including telescopes, satellites, and microscopes. Remote sensing can reveal the distribution pattern of a mineral on the Earth's surface. High-power lenses used with polarized light can reveal the internal patterns of rock crystals. The Hubble telescope can photograph stars that ceased to exist before our Sun came into existence. Geomorphological patterns are traces of the forces that made the Earth and which continue to shape its evolution. Environmental designers benefit, functionally and aesthetically, from understanding geological patterns. Next, growth patterns. Darcy Thompson was interested in the relationship between mathematics and the generation of form. He wrote in 1961 that the harmony of the world is made manifest in form and number, and the heart and soul of all the poetry of natural philosophy are embodied in the concept of mathematical beauty. This relationship, which must be of interest to designers, is beautifully illustrated by the nautilus shell, which grows as a geometrical progression. Next, visual patterns. Asked to say what pattern means, most people will think first of visual patterns. In a 1974 book on the language of pattern, 4 Western designers write about their interest in Islamic patterns. As students, they had learned to regard pattern as superficial decoration of form and as form dictated by function. But in the body of their book, they examine the use of numbers and mathematical systems in design. Transformation is used as a term to describe the process of creatively transposing a pattern from one context to another, making use of changes of scale, dimension, and viewpoint to generate fresh perceptions. The Vedic Square, an arrangement of numbers shown in figure 16, was transformed into lines, planes, brickwork, glazed tiles, garden plans, buildings, and even town plans. So the authors of The Language of Pattern conclude that patterns structure our thinking, and pattern is the structure of mind. Therefore, to evolve our knowledge of pattern is also to evolve ourselves. Next, design patterns. Designers have used pattern books for centuries. The design ideas of the Italian Renaissance were circulated in Northern Europe by means of pattern books. And these books influenced metalworkers, plasterers, furniture makers, and other craftsmen. Most of the houses in Georgian London were adapted from architectural pattern books. But as 19th century Romanticism and the cult of the individual reached their heights, it came to be thought that there was something morally disreputable, if not indictable, about copying from the work of others. All praise was heaped upon the heroic innovator. Pattern books became despised. Next, I'll have a go at a classification of the patterns we've been considering. The above examples of friends of the pattern language were chosen from different areas of knowledge and can be conceived as structures, which is a more fashionable term than patterns. But for designers, patterns is a more natural grouping than structures, I think. Patterns are of different ages and can be classified like geological formations using the terms primary, secondary, tertiary and quaternary, as shown in figure 17. The sequence is chronological. Primary patterns existed before man. Secondary patterns, like traces of Stone Age man, are the oldest signs of human life on Earth. Tertiary patterns, like cave paintings, can be very ancient. They're art. Quaternary patterns are more recent, of the type Alexander wrote. The four types of pattern can therefore be discussed in groups. Primary or natural patterns are found in the existing landscape, resulting from flows of energy, from geology, from the nature of materials, from the processes of growth and decay. They might be represented in words and numbers, but maps and drawings are likely to be the most useful format. Ian McHarg's map overlays include the primary patterns of the existing landscape. The emerging patterns of landscape ecology, discussed by Foreman and Gudrun, are of great importance. Dim Sylvia Crow's book on the pattern of landscape considers natural patterns from both geomorphological and aesthetic points of view. Secondary or human patterns are found in both urban and rural landscapes. They result from the behaviour of humans, who adapt places to satisfy needs for food, shelter, transport, comfort and security. Tertiary or aesthetic patterns result from the artist's imagination or an aesthetic appreciation of nature. They may come from geometry, mathematics, decoration, representation, mythology, symbolism, allegory, metaphor, abstraction, philosophy, poetry, music, and a narrative. There are creative artists with expertise in all these areas. And environmental designers can work with them and learn from them. Quaternary or archetypal patterns are tried and tested combinations of the other patterns. They are prototypes that have proved successful, like plant associations, house types, farm types, and settlement types. Their place in outdoor design, which is a site-specific art, is as components. Like a sundial, no outdoor design can be exactly right for more than one point on the Earth's surface. Alexander's focus was on archetypal patterns, but as illustrated in the following examples, he does make use of the other pattern types. His patterns 64, 74 and 168 draw on natural and human patterns. Pattern 64 is pools and streams. It relates to natural patterns because we came from water, our bodies are largely water, and water plays a fundamental role in our psychology. Similarly, pattern 74, animals, states that animals are as important a part of nature as the trees and grass and flowers. And there is evidence that animals may play a role in a child's emotional development. And pattern 168, connection to earth, arises because a house feels isolated from the nature around it unless its floors are interleaved directly with the earth that is around the house. Alexander didn't like blocks of apartments. The pattern language avoids purely aesthetic patterns, though some patterns clearly do involve visual judgments. Number 249, ornament, for example, states that all people have the instinct to decorate their surroundings. Comparably, pattern 235, small panes, recommends users to divide each window into small panes because the smaller panes are, the more intensely windows help connect us with what's on the other side. Aesthetics are treated at greater length in a 1993 book by Alexander on the colour and geometry of Turkish carpets. Seeing them as a foreshadowing of 21st century art, Alexander wrote of the similarity of these carpets to what the world of Bach and Monteverdi is in the world of music, a realm of pure structure in which the deepest human emotions can have their play. Dealing almost entirely with pattern and ornament, carpets are an exercise in colour and geometry. Aesthetics were further analysed in Alexander's 4 volumes on the nature of order, published after this essay was written, from 203 to 4. The greatest strength of Alexander's pattern language lies in its imaginative appreciation of human patterns. They redirect designers' attention away from style and back towards human behaviour. For example, pattern 119 values arcades because they play a vital role in the way that people interact with buildings. And pattern 164 recommends street windows because a street without windows is blind and frightening, and because it is equally uncomfortable to be in a house which bounds a public street with no window at all on the street. Some of the patterns derive from what an earlier generation of psychologists would have called instincts. Number 181, fire, observes that the need for fire is almost as fundamental as the need for water. And number 129, common areas at the heart, states that no social group, whether a family, a work group or a school group, can survive without constant informal contact among its members. The converse of this proposition, from pattern 141, a room of one's own, is that no one can be close to others without also having frequent opportunities to be alone. Alexander's proposal for a teenager's cottage in pattern 154 could be part of an initiation rite. To mark a child's coming of age, transform his place in the home into a kind of cottage that expresses in a physical way the beginnings of independence. My conclusion to Chapter 3 of City as Landscape and to this podcast is that the full set of patterns required for outdoor planning and design depends on the nature of the proposals that are to be made. There is no finite set of survey information that can be assembled before starting work. There is no one inescapable starting point for a design project. This is the fatal flaw in the SAD, Survey Analysis Design method. When making a new place, planners and designers must know what factors made the existing place, how places can be changed, and what makes people judge places as good or bad. Specialised vocabulary is therefore necessary. Patterns can use words, diagrams, models and drawings to describe complex processes and qualities. The language will not be symbolic like computer code, but nor will it be a predominantly spoken language. For planning and design, it is most likely to be diagrams supported by words. Many patterns will be appreciated by the general population. Others will be particular to special groups. Others will be unique to individuals. Words provide a common currency with which to interrelate different structural approaches to the design and analysis of place. Diagrams can have a similar role and are more readily transformed into designs. Structures reside in the environment, but they are visible only to people and animals that have reasons to look for them. Each situation can be analysed within different structural frameworks. Ideas are at the heart of the design process and lead on to surveys, to analyses, and to designs. Patterns help designers to handle the complexity of environmental design, and I recommend them. The third chapter ends here. Rereading it after 24 years, I haven't changed my mind about the points made, but do feel that the argument might have been shortened or lengthened, but definitely simplified. So here's an extra comment. As a student, we were taught a 3-sheet design method. They were a survey sheet, an analysis sheet, and a design sheet. In time, this was extended to a 5-sheet method, with the addition of an appraisal sheet and a concept sheet. Then it became a 6-sheet method, with the addition of a mood board, also called an image sheet. The argument of this chapter has been for a further extension to a multi-layered design approach, with the layers relating to areas of knowledge: ecology, landscape ecology, geomorphology, psychology, art, poetry, and many others. My fullest experience of this method was with the design of a Buddhist-influenced dragon garden for the Druk White Lotus School in Ladakh. It's at an altitude of 3,500 metres, 11,500 feet, on the Indian side of the Tibetan border. The design team had volunteer consultants from many professions working as equals with school staff and construction staff, with a cooperative, anatta, non-self Buddhist ethos. The design draws on the patterns of Buddhist symbols, on hydrological patterns, on ecological patterns, on edaphological patterns, social patterns, geomorphological patterns, agricultural patterns, and many more. There is, of course, no suggestion that all the pattern types should be used on any one project. Everything depends on the designer's imaginative interpretation of what the client wants and what the site needs. As will be further discussed in the podcast based on Chapter 4 of City as Landscape, ideas lie at the heart of the design process. They always have done, and, I hope, they always will do. Well, thanks for listening. If interested, you can find more of my views on the gardenvisit.com and Landscape Architecture YouTube channels and websites. Or you can subscribe on your favourite podcast player to hear future podcasts about designing cities, landscapes and gardens. Thank you.